everyone! In today's video, we'll be discussing how to write story arcs for a manga or comic. Let's get straight into the video. First of all, what is a story arc? Arcs in a manga or comic are smaller storylines that go alongside the main storyline, sometimes for a certain number of chapters or even across volume. The purpose of an arc is to break up longer storylines to make them easier to follow. For example, One Piece is a very long series, so to break it up, the creator divided it into many arcs. Usually when someone is referring to a certain part of the One Piece series, they will usually be referring to a certain arc by name because it is easier to refer to certain parts that way because it is such a long series. Each arc has its own beginning, middle and end, and is sort of like a smaller story alongside the main story. These arcs are also usually titled to identify them, such as East Blue Saga, Sky Island Saga, and Thriller Bark Saga, which are all names of arcs from One Piece. Now you might be wondering, does your manga or comic need to have arcs? And it really depends. Not all manga or comics need to have story arcs. I only recommend adding arcs if your manga or comic is a longer series, usually of over 10 volumes. You do not need arcs, however, if your story is longer but it's more episodic. For example, if every volume of your manga is more like a story on its own, then you won't need arcs because every chapter or every volume is already presented in an episodic structure. Arcs are only important if the story goes on for a really long amount of time and you need something to really divide that story into more easily understandable parts. So if your story is on the shorter side, then you won't need to worry about having story arcs. So if you have determined that your story needs to have arcs, then let's look further at the structure of an arc and how to apply it to your manga or comic. Story arcs can be written in different ways, but I'll be showing my own particular technique. I find this technique to be the most helpful to me when I am writing arcs, so I will be sharing it with you today. This particular writing technique is based off of English writing structures. You might commonly hear these terms applied to regular novel writing, but the reason why I use these terms is to make it easier to apply if you're choosing to write a manga or a comic. So in writing story arcs in your manga or comic, here is a structure of an arc that I like to follow. The beginning, the problem, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Following this type of structure can help you to present the smaller story structure of an arc within the main storyline. Now let's go further and talk a little bit more about each part of this process to make it easier for you to write arcs in your own manga or stories. The first part is the beginning. In the beginning of the arc, establish the main characters and where this arc is taking place. A story arc may begin when you introduce a new character, the characters may go to a new location, or you may introduce a new item or object. Some event happens that triggers the beginning of the arc, and then that sets the scene for the rest of the arc, and then the story can continue from there. Let's look at the next part, which is the problem. Create a problem that acts as an obstacle in your character's path. So you've set the scene, you've introduced the main characters, and your character is now going on this part of the journey in this arc, but they run into a problem or an obstacle which stops them in their tracks. And this problem will be the main problem in the arc that will need to be resolved in order for them to move forward. Next is the inciting incident. Create a situation that forces your character into action towards facing these problems and resolving them. So once you have the problem that your character is now faced with, you need an inciting incident that basically forces them to want to keep moving forward and overcome this problem. Without the inciting incident, they may not have enough motivation to get through this problem and obstacle and keep moving forward in the story. So let me give a bit more of an example of this. You may begin your story arc, and maybe at the beginning your character discovers a magical object that is going to be able to save the world in your character's story. However, they run into the problem. Maybe the problem is the fact that the magical object is broken somehow. For some reason, the magical object doesn't work. Then you get to the inciting incident. And when you get to this point, you need to ask yourself, why does your character care about the problem? So in this instance, why should your character care about this broken magical object? It might cause problems in the whole world, but why is it your character's responsibility to fix this? In this instance, I would recommend making it something personal to your character. Maybe someone your character deeply cares about is going to be affected if your character does not fix the problem. And so that is the character's inciting incident. Maybe something happens to someone they care about which forces them into action, and they realize that they need to get through this obstacle and solve the problem if they are going to help this person that they care about. So in the inciting incident in the story arc, you need to ask yourself, what causes your character to move into action? What causes your character to want to get through this problem and find the solution? Next, let's look at the rising action. This will be the main part of the arc. This is your characters rising forward and working through the arc. So show your character's steps towards working through this situation and resolving the problem. Consider what steps your character needs to take and what course of action they would go on in order to get through this situation. Through the rising action in the story arc, your character may meet other characters, discover new things, or learn new techniques. Your character may need to train in some way to get stronger in order to defeat a particular villain or gain new powers and abilities. Maybe they need to meet another character or help someone else, or learn from someone else in order to get through the situation. Whichever it is, all of these events happen in the rising action of the arc, and this rising action will go on for a while until we reach the main point of the arc. The next part in the writing structure is the climax. This is the major point of the story that all other points of the story have been working toward. This could be a major battle scene, a realization, or a plot twist. After this, the characters finally resolve the problem and understand what they need to do to get through this obstacle. So this part of the story arc is where all the other points have been working towards. Through your character learning new techniques or understanding other characters or gaining new abilities, they begin to learn how they can get through this point in the story. And once they are at this point, they may need to go through a battle scene or a big conflict or a plot twist, or they may have a sudden realization and a turning point that helps them understand what they need to do next. This is the most important part in the story arc, so you really need to consider what you need to have at this point in the story and what all the other points are working towards. Next is the falling action. After resolving the problem, this is where the arc begins to wrap up and the final pieces of this part of the story come together. Other situations are resolved and the arc works towards a conclusion. And finally, there is the resolution. The arc does come to a conclusion, but it should be open-ended, leaving space for the next arc to begin. I know that this particular story structure follows more Western writing techniques, but I feel like understanding this story structure can really help with understanding how to present these story arcs in a more structured way. It makes it easier to break down the process to make it easier for you to create in a manga or comic. If you wish to follow a more authentic writing structure for Japanese manga or comics, then you may wish to follow the Kishotenketsu style. The Kishotenketsu style is broken into 4 main components. This is Kiku, which is the introduction, Shoku, which is development, Tenku, where there is a twist, and Keku, which is the conclusion. In the introduction, you would introduce the characters and set the scene. In the second part, Shoku, you would provide more information to develop that story further, introducing new settings or situations and resolving any problems that may arise throughout this situation. In the third part, Tenku, with the twist, you would end up twisting the events around, turning it in a way that your audience may not expect. And the fourth part, Keku, you would end up leading it to a conclusion, usually more open-ended to lead into the next arc. You can choose whichever writing structure you would prefer. The reason I mentioned my own writing structure first is because I wanted to share the techniques that I like to use the most. But I think it's important to try different techniques and find the techniques that work best for you and the story you're telling. Keep in mind that the story arc should blend with the main story. As the characters are experiencing the events in the arc, they should also be working towards the main goal in the story. The arc should have a purpose and should not just be there for no reason. Whether the reason is to give more character development, to show a character's training arc, or to help the characters further work towards and understand their goals, the purpose of the arc is also to help the story keep momentum. To give an example, the main goal might be to find a powerful magical character. In the arc, the characters may be trying to locate a teleportation device in order to help them to get to the magical character. However, by the end of the arc, they may have found the teleportation device, but it might be broken. In the next arc, they may need to find someone who can help them to repair the teleportation device. Story arcs can go across multiple chapters or even volumes, especially in the case of long-running series like One Piece. They can be as long or as short as necessary. Their purpose is to break up the story to make it easier to write and present. So this is how you write story arcs in a manga or comic. The best way to consider story arcs is thinking about them as though they are smaller stories within the big story. The arcs can help to break up the main story to make it easier to present. And these smaller stories within the main story can help it all keep momentum and to keep the pacing of the story throughout your book. So thank you so much for joining me in today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please let me know in the comment section down below. Let me know what kind of story arcs you're creating because I would love to hear your thoughts. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day and I will see you in the next video.